Soon after the Thomas M. Cooley Law School established a presence, can you hear now? How about now? There we go. Soon after the Thomas M. Cooley Law School established a presence in downtown Grand Rapids, our president, Don LeDuc, and our Associate Dean of International Programs, William Weiner, recognized the value of such an important resource for international legal, geopolitical, and diplomatic understanding. Cooley joined the World Affairs Council as a member, and our Foreign Study program is delighted to sponsor events like tonight's lecture on issues surrounding the Northwest Passage. From a legal perspective, today's lecture presents an intriguing set of issues. The law of the sea and territorial sovereignty are the bedrock of modern public international law. With the onset of the colonial era, the seafaring nations recognized the need of a global set of rules. Increased contact in far-flung locations required solidification of borders, rights of discovery, and state sovereignty. This shift to a global focus from more regional ones led to the creation of the current international regime, including institutions such as the United Nations. From the perspective of current events, today's lecture is also very timely. One may recall that Russia planted a flag below the Arctic Circle a few years ago by submarine with the clear intention of establishing a claim by discovery to the seafloor and to subsurface resources. In fact, former President George Bush met with Russian President Vladimir Putin in 2007 at the Lobster Summit to discuss access to and ownership of the huge hydrocarbon reserves under the Arctic ice cap. Last week, the North Pacific Fishery Management Council met and voted to close the Arctic waters off northern Alaska to fishing, pending further study of the health and sustainability of the fish living under the now retreating ice pack. Acts of piracy off the coast of Somalia remind us that issues involving freedom of the high seas are still relevant. Among more accomplishments than there is time to recount, which are set out in the brochure, today's guest is chair of the U.S. Arctic Research Commission and was also past president of the Alaska World Affairs Council. Ladies and gentlemen, if you would join me in welcoming Mr. Meade Treadwell.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Dixie Anderson and Craig Merlin and others here who have hosted me, and it's a lot of fun for me. Everybody in Alaska, or most people from Alaska, are from someplace else. So people ask me where I'm from. I say Connecticut and Michigan. My brother lives in Traverse City. I make it to Leland at least once a summer, and you're likely to find me either messing up on water skis or coming in last in a sailboat. But I love getting back to Michigan. I learned to ski here, and it's a great place. I also just want to say congratulations to the World Affairs Council. I am a former member of the board and president of the Alaska World Affairs Council, and we consider ourselves to be one of the best small-town World Affairs Councils, but the fact that I am now speaking to the best small-town World Affairs Council in the country is actually a singular accomplishment as far as I'm concerned. I also just wanted to say to the high school students who are here, when I was a junior in high school taking physics, I remember having an argument with Mr. Chesto. And I said, why do I need to learn this? I think I might want to go to law school or might want to be in business. And he said, how about politics? Your dad's involved in politics. I said, yeah, I might want to be in politics too. And he said, well, you might have to do something like site a nuclear power plant. You might want to know a little bit of physics. And here I was a junior in high school, and I said, well, maybe, I don't know. But now I'm an advisor to the National Science Foundation. I work very closely with the science advisors to two presidents. I found myself leading a delegation about 15 years ago, the first U.S. delegation to the closest nuclear power plant to Russia, to Alaska, of the Chernobyl design. And so I guess I would say science and policy go together, and I'm glad you're here studying this today, and good luck, and I hope that when you do get a chance to do some of those fun things that your science education and your political education gives you, you have as much fun as I'm having. So let me take it from here. The title of today's talk is Who Owns the Northwest Passage and Other Questions Posed by the Changing Arctic. And I'm going to get to this later, but I just want to say I'm holding in my hands a White House decision document, a National Security Presidential Directive number 66 and a Homeland Security Presidential Directive number 25 titled Arctic Region Policy. And the United States just issued a brand new Arctic policy for the first time since 1994. And we'll talk about some of the questions that went into the formation of that policy, but it all begins with science. I chair an organization called the U.S. Arctic Research Commission. It was established by Congress in 1984, and it has 7 members who advise the President and Congress. Our terms are staggered on goals for the U.S. Arctic Research Program. Among our commissioners are people who I study policy at a research institute called the Institute of the North, founded by former Alaska Governor Wally Hickel. Michelle Longo-Etter is a fisheries lawyer who works on North Pacific fisheries issues from Oregon. Helvi Sandvik is head of a $1 billion-plus Alaska Native Corporation, was born in a village in far western Alaska, and I served with her in Governor Hickel's cabinet. She was Deputy Commissioner of Transportation when I was Deputy Commissioner of Environmental Conservation. Buck Sharpton is a former NASA astrophysicist who is now the Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Alaska. Vera Metcalf is head of a very interesting co-management group of Alaska Natives who co-manage walrus in the United States with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and she is a Siberian Yupik speaker from St. Lawrence Island, where you can see Russia from there. Warren Zapol is an anesthesiologist at Harvard Medical School and an expert in polar health issues. And Charlie Vorismarty is at the City College of New York and a hydrologist of global renown. So it is this group that goes out and works with the science community and the public to say, where should our science go in the United States? U.S. Arctic research is about $400 million a year. We cooperate with over a dozen nations. We use infrastructure to do our research worth billions of dollars. And this is completing the International Polar Year, which has involved over 60 nations working at both ends of the poles of the Earth to dramatically increase knowledge about the Arctic and the Antarctic. Now, how many of you here have been to Alaska? How many of you here have been north of the Arctic Circle? Okay. Those of you who haven't, I just want to say, don't go when you're young, because you'll be like me and you'll get caught and you're not going to want to go anywhere else. But the welcome mat is open any time. The United States has been an Arctic nation since 1867. This is the canceled check, actually, that the United States sent to Russia to buy Alaska for a little over $7 million. As you may recall from reading the history books, buying Alaska was a debatable issue at the time. Somebody called it a sucked orange. In other words, the Russians had taken all the resources of value out of it. Somebody else called it Seward's folly, and it had been called, my favorite was Walrussia. But the point is that we did get it, and we own it, and it is very much an America's responsibility to pay attention to the Arctic as a region, because while most people would think of us as having ocean boundaries in the Atlantic and the Pacific, we also have a new ocean in the Arctic that is becoming suddenly and rapidly accessible. If you can see Alaska at the top of the screen, let me just take you on a walk around the Arctic Circle for a second. If you go west, you find yourself in Chukotka, a region of Russia known as the Russian Far East, and later on, walking around, you'll find yourself going across Siberia. You'll get into the Scandinavian countries, Finland, Sweden, Norway. Out in the ocean there, you'll find a little country called Iceland with a population about the size of Grand Rapids. Then you'll get to a country or a region called Greenland, part of Denmark, which has about 60,000 people. Northern Canada, and of course Alaska. These 8 Arctic nations comprise an international organization called the Arctic Council, which was not possible until 20 years ago when the Berlin Wall came down and the communist nations opened up to the rest of the world and said, let's cooperate. And I've had the pleasure of being involved in Arctic cooperation for all of those last 20 years, including being on the first flight across the Bering Strait we called a friendship flight in 1988. And yes, you can see Russia from Alaska, but I've also seen Alaska from Russia, which is kind of fun too. Thank you, Tina Fey. Today's talk has two parts. First, I'm going to dwell a little bit on the science and answer the question, change in the Arctic, what is happening? Because this is a place that is changing very, very quickly. It is not your grandfather's Arctic. And then second, because this is a World Affairs Council, we're going to ask the questions of what does Arctic change mean for the United States in global affairs? There was an Arctic Council project called the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment completed about 4 years ago, which detailed changes happening in many sectors of the Arctic, from vegetation moving north, ocean and climate, forest and grassland, changes in human health, sea ice and icebergs, massive deglaciation in Alaska, and large amounts of melt in Greenland. Changes to sea mammals. And let me just run through a few of those changes very quickly. And if it gets a little complicated, we're going to just flash on and save your questions. The New Yorker kind of put it this way. The last trip under the polar ice cap is on its way, but probably the largest driver of change in the Arctic is the changing sea ice. This was the minimum sea ice the 16th of September in 2002, and here was it in 2007, the lowest minimum ever recorded in human history. In 2008, we actually believe the volume of sea ice was less, but the ice cover was slightly more. We have seen a dramatic sea ice retreat that would, if you were to cover the entire lower 48, it would range from the east coast of the Atlantic all the way to Kansas City, up and down. It's a huge amount of ice cover that we've lost in the Arctic Ocean. And that ice continues to have a retreat. It's particularly pronounced among the Alaskan and Eurasian coastlines and the Canadian archipelago. And we see no real end to this process, because once you do reduce the ice, we've had a massive outpouring of multi-year ice out the Bering Strait east of Greenland. We've seen the ice cover comes back in a cold winter like this one, but by next September, I expect we'll be near the minimums again. It is the ocean, as a result, has seen pronounced warming since 1995, and it corresponds to the ice-free regions. In 2007, the ocean temperature in parts of the Arctic Ocean was up to 5 degrees centigrade warmer, a significant difference. The atmosphere has had relatively warm temperatures over the entire Arctic region, also with a change of perhaps 5 degrees centigrade. These slides are from an Arctic report card produced by NOAA each fall. And so the sum of the parts is that with warming air temperatures, melting ice, warming ocean surface, we have kind of a cyclical effect that continues to warm the area above the Arctic. And it provides compelling evidence of change, and the plot thickens because what we see in the models that are projecting change going forward is that if you look at global average air temperatures, you may see a temperature change of 1 or 2 degrees centigrade, but at the poles, you're seeing a much larger change, almost a crack the whip effect. And that is of concern quite a bit to the people who live there. So the road ahead is that we have the sea ice minimum in 2000 that you see on this slide, and there are many different projections now done by modelers, and we're trying very hard to improve the models that show a potential ice-free summer minimum as early as 2040. By this chart, some have predicted that it may even come earlier than that, much earlier than that. So the idea of an accessible Arctic Ocean presents a number of geopolitical issues, which we'll talk about in a moment. It also presents issues for other things we care about. There are a number of species who dramatically depend on the ice sheets over benthic resources, over things you can find on the ocean bottom, the shallow ocean bottom, and when the ice moves out further, it makes it tougher for these animals to survive. Polar bears were recently put on a threatened species list by Secretary of Interior Kempthorne. Walrus may be next, and there are 4 species of seals that are also ice dependent, and the concerns for these seals are significant. Ring seals, bearded seals, ribbon seals, and spotted seals. And they all use the pack ice at some point in their cycle now, and the question is, can these populations grow as the ice moves further offshore? Once you take away these large animals, or the change happens to the habitat of the animals, then change happens to the people who depend on these resources for subsistence. I know many Alaskan natives who survive on whale meat, seal meat, walrus meat. Actually, and not just Alaskans. I've had walrus. The first time I had walrus was at a walrus festival, kind of like a country fair in Chukotka. The challenge is for people who have lived for 10,000 years basically doing the same thing of seasonally catching subsistence foods with climate change are quite significant. For those of us who have dwellings on Arctic shores, and these could be houses, hospitals, clinics, they could also be pipeline facilities and so forth, we're seeing rapid erosion because the ice cover acts as a breakwater. And when you take the ice away, then the storm surges are causing tremendous erosion to the point where we have to move several villages now over the next few years. I was at one point this summer with Jane Lubchenco, who's the new head of NOAA, appointed by President Obama, and we were up at Point Barrow, the northernmost point in the United States, with a group of archaeologists who were there literally racing against the ocean to recover some 6,000 or 8,000-year-old skeletons that were about to be washed away. And the land is getting shorter. From my old department, in the Department of Environmental Conservation, I was told a number of 23 dumps where these dumps had been quite inshore dumps where now garbage was beginning to wash in the ocean because the erosion had been coming so quickly. Not only are we seeing these changes on land, we're also seeing changes in the ocean. This New Yorker cartoon says, "I'm not sure what I am, but I believe I'm a product of Norway." Right now, we haven't seen evidence of an intermixing of stocks in the Arctic Ocean, but what Paul mentioned in terms of the changes, the conservation approach taken by the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, we have seen evidence of major fish stocks moving north, and we've said before we open up a fishery in that ocean, let's be very, very clear we understand what the ecosystem is. This, I promise you, is about the most complicated slide I'll have here today, but what's happening is that with a change in the ice retreat, you get a change in the bloom of zooplankton. When you get a change in the bloom of zooplankton, then you get a change in the kind of species who can depend on the zooplankton and so forth. If you have that, what it means is that an early bloom favors benthic production or ground fish. So if you go to McDonald's and like a McDonald's fish and witch sandwich, that might be doing well. A late bloom favors pelagic production that might be higher species. So it means that if you like crab and the way the ice is changing, it may be harmful to the crab resources of the Bering Sea. And in fact, the snow crab resource population has contracted to the north, according to this slide prepared by Phil Mundy at the National Marine Fisheries Service. We're also seeing a very interesting change that you wouldn't expect with changing ice, and that's called the acidification of the oceans. And we have an interesting situation where the more carbon dioxide there is in the atmosphere, the more of it is absorbed by the ocean water. And if you know how acid a Coca-Cola can be when you drop an egg or something in it, have it keep for a few days, we're seeing ocean acidification. And one of the real challenges for ocean acidification is a change in animals that require a certain pH level in the ocean to form hard shells are put in greater jeopardy. And so this is an issue that the National Academy of Sciences is studying right now, and we're working hard to understand its effects. Not only are there these natural changes and these changes that we've seen in the use of marine living resources, we also have changes in the composition and the use of energy in the Arctic. The Institute of the North recently held an International Arctic Energy Summit about 14 months ago, and this year we had the release of a U.S. Geological Survey study which showed that inside the Arctic Circle, more than 15% of the world's undiscovered natural gas is likely to be found more than 30% of the world's undiscovered natural gas is to be found, and close to 15% of the world's undiscovered oil. And this is conventional sources. It does not include the massive resources we know of gas hydrates, which exist inside the Arctic region, and so forth. What's interesting about this slide is that when you look at oil and gas resources of the North and energy resources of the North, energy is we are very much dependent on energy development in the North for our economies. Alaska's state budget is 93% provided by royalties and taxes from development of oil. If you move over to Russia, to the west, most of the cash surpluses of that country have come from development of oil in the Arctic. Move further west to Norway, and you'll get the same story. Go to a country like Iceland. It's not oil, but it's geothermal power that has been a mainstay of that country's economy, and I can get into other issues in the Icelandic economy in a minute, but the fact is that energy, that's a country that's very dependent on energy as well. You look at northern Canada, and the gas development in both the eastern and western north of Canada is a significant part of that country's economy, and now we're back to Alaska. So the point is that oil and gas and energy, no matter what United States policies end up to be, and there is a debate in this country on offshore drilling, will be a significant player. Arctic energy will be a significant player in the world to come. This time last year, the U.S. Minerals Management Service held a lease sale in the Chukchi Sea in the northwest part of Alaska. There were 29.4 million acres put up for bid. That's quite a bit of land, by the way. And the price was estimated by the Office of Management and Budget to be a $60 million lease sale. When the bids were opened, a record $2.7 billion had been bid for rights to drill on that land in the Chukchi Sea. So there's been a significant oil rush in the Arctic and throughout the Arctic. In western Russia, which will be the most productive region of the Arctic for probably some time to come, demand for ice-class tankers has been steadily rising. This was an American Bureau of Shipping report in 2005. The estimation was that around the time of that report that Russian oil exports from that region would rise by close to 100-fold in a 10-year period. And that's through this ship there is the MV Arctic, which has actually been plying Arctic waters for some time, and we'll talk about some of the other changes that are bringing back. Technology, we've talked about natural changes, I've talked about global demand for resources. There are also some changes in technology that are making the Arctic much more accessible. This slide was given to us by actually at a talk at the World Affairs Council by the chairman of Iridium, a global telecommunications company, where every time somebody pushes the send button on an Iridium phone, a white dot would appear on their map. This is the use of their phone system in July 2001, and there it is in July 2006. You're seeing the Arctic and the northern region getting much busier. And now some of that is by aircraft, and some of that shows their success as a company. But the fact is that this is a region which is becoming much more used. That has brought up we are doing an assessment right now. If you want to come with us to Norway in April, the Arctic Marine Shipping Assessment, which our commission has been helping lead and staff for the United States, has been assessing what's been happening in Arctic shipping. Because, as you know, for 500 years, people have been trying to to make the Northwest Passage and the Northern Sea Route a regular venue for commerce. This slide from, I guess it's a NASA picture, but the slide was developed by the chief of the Coast Guard in Alaska. The red squares are what he calls choke points. And you can see a choke point in the Bering Strait to the point where they jokingly refer to it now as the Bering Gate. You've got choke points in the Northwest Passage, choke points in two parts of the Northern Sea Route in Russia. And we're seeing quite a bit of extended marine use in the Arctic. I'm going to flash through 5 slides here. Most of the use of the Arctic Ocean today is for kind of destinational traffic. It's people bringing goods in or taking goods out of the Arctic. And it can be hard minerals, marine tourism. You can see the yellow circles are the largest zinc mine in the world is in western Alaska. A high-grade iron ore mine, what will be the largest iron ore mine in the world, is under development now on Baffin Island in northern Canada, which expects to ship out of the Arctic Ocean year-round. The green slides you see there are venues for tourism, which are growing. Add to that fisheries. In the white circles, quite a bit there. Oil and gas in some of the venues that I mentioned before. Summer sea lift, where people are bringing goods in and out of villages in the north. And exploration and science, where you see lots of other ship traffic. That leads to a snapshot that we will present to the Arctic ministers, these ministers from the 8 Arctic nations in April, that says, essentially in 2004 we had close to 5,500 ships of 100 tons or greater operating in the Arctic and adjacent ice-covered waters. And so Arctic shipping is not a future thing, it is a now thing. There is a lot going on and a lot more to come. And that gives us many challenges and risks, both making sure that the ships can operate safely, but also some geopolitical issues, which I'll get to in a moment. So let me close off that section by saying the change happening in the Arctic is change in the natural background, it's change in technology, it's change in global demand, it's change in things which are patterns of human use, and all of these things were part of our discussion as we developed that National Security Council, Homeland Security Council decision document, which was released toward the end of the Bush administration. Now I'm going to lead to 5 questions that are basically along the lines of what does Arctic change mean for the United States in global affairs, and these are really subjects of the Great Decisions series. Question number 1 is global climate talks. We will get together with the other nations of the world in Copenhagen in December for a COP, a conference of our participating parties, to talk about new limits for greenhouse gases and climate. And there are 2 questions at least that the Arctic science is leading us to ask. One is, can a global climate regime return us to an Arctic normal, cold, where we have at least enough sea ice cover to maintain a habitat for the species that depend on that sea ice. And it also leads our commission to ask the question of what kind of science do we need to track further Arctic impacts on climate. A critical reason of watching this is that as the sea ice goes away, we have a changing albedo effect in the Arctic. Much more sunlight is absorbed by the ocean rather than reflected out into space. And so taking away that ice actually leads the Earth to have a positive feedback to grow a warmer Earth all told. And so we need to watch that. That's an important science issue we need to watch. We are, of course, tracking the rise in CO2 in the global atmosphere with a series of monitoring stations around the world, the most famous of which is at Mauna Kea in Hawaii. But you will see data that goes into these averages from the Arctic as well. And we're now seeing some signs that the Arctic may be a sink for CO2, so we have to watch that very, very closely. We also are watching very closely what's happening with methane. These are bubbles in a frozen pond. This is the glove of a scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks named Katie Walter. And she can poke a hole in any one of these bubbles and flick a bic, and she'll have a flaming pond. And it's not Lake Erie. This is natural emitting gas that is coming out of the Earth as it is now. Close to 25% of the world's embedded carbon is either in the boreal forest of the Arctic in the north, or in the permafrost and the tundra. And so the question here is, we need to have, as we go to global limits, we need to have good science to understand what Mother Nature is doing in background. You wouldn't sail a canoe or paddle a canoe down a river without paying attention to the natural current in the background. No matter which way you steer, you're not going to get where you're going unless you know that. And as we go into a global regime to check tailpipes, one of the arguments that we make from the Arctic is you better dang well pay attention to this part of the world to see what's happening with natural emissions of greenhouse gases. A second issue there is, what kind of target should we set if we are going to set greenhouse gas targets in a climate regime that could ultimately see us return sea ice. There are some scientists who suggest just take your foot off the accelerator, and if we can get to these reductions by 2050, we may ultimately see the ice come back. There have been some other modeling done. This was a slide given to us by Marika Holland at the National Center for Atmospheric Research in Boulder that said, if we could fix CO2 levels globally at 2020 values, we may have a point of return of the ice. If we get to 2030 values, we may not. And so one of the questions Arctic scientists are asking are what levels should we advise negotiators going to Copenhagen to get to be able to return to some kind of an Arctic normal. That leads us to a question asked by this cartoonist who is kind of reminding us that this is itself an experiment. He said the ruling powers in the early Aztec Empire believed they could affect the weather by ripping out a few hearts, and now we're going to try to change the weather by changing your patterns and perhaps ripping out a few billfolds. The International Energy Agency, which was formed by Henry Kissinger after the first OPEC crisis, came out with a report last fall that said the industrialized nations of the world should expect to spend up to $43 trillion by 2050 to counter the effects of climate change. And we've got very, very expensive decisions before us. I guess is the point I want to leave you with in this. And looking at a global climate regime, I want to say wherever you live, where we're all going to be paying the bill, don't ignore the Arctic and what we're putting out, because it's going to be trying to counter some of those effects of the changing albedo and the changing outgassing of the tundra that will show whether or not we're successful. We expect to finish this International Polar Year with an Arctic observing network that will help us track what's happening in the environment much, much better than we have before. A second set of questions about what does Arctic change mean for the U.S. in global affairs all relate to sovereignty and security. A big question now with Russia planting a flag at the pole, with the territorial claims being made under the law of the sea, is who owns what in the Arctic. There have been commentators who have written, Scott Borgeson wrote in Foreign Affairs last April, that we could even get to wartime conflicts in the Arctic in terms of battles over resources. NATO had a big meeting in Iceland at the end of January saying we have to have a bigger NATO presence in the Arctic region because of the potential for conflict, not just among Arctic nations, but also from others who might be coming in. There was I got news this afternoon that an icebreaker design for a new U.S. icebreaker, which had been in the stimulus package in the Senate until this weekend, was dropped out. I'm not sure what happened to the new icebreaker in the Great Lakes. We tend to go for funding together. But the question of does the U.S. have the capability to project power in that region is an issue that was thoroughly discussed during this policy review. So who owns what in the Arctic? How do we avoid conflict? How do we ensure access for science, a major issue that we have? And how do we protect the newly accessible homeland of the North? And this is a set of sovereignty and security questions that we've been looking at. The fellow down in the lower right there is Artur Chilingarov, a member of the Russian Duma, a hero of the Soviet Union, a well-known polar explorer who was part of the group in that submarine that planted the titanium flag at the North Pole in the summer of 2007. I had dinner with him last spring. He's been a regular visitor to Alaska, and we've generally worked together on Arctic issues with the Russians. The Russian claim is to 45% of the Arctic Ocean. And the question of what does the Russian claim mean for the American claim and the Canadian claim will be a very interesting issue that will be debated basically in a tribunal set up by the United Nations under the law of the sea. The only real rub right now is the United States is not a signer of the law, or we have not ratified the law of the sea treaty. And until we ratify it, we can't be at the table. But you had this, we even made the Colbert report, question of who owns the Arctic 2007 when this whole issue came up. But the the general issue is that the Russian claim will be satisfied in a legal tribunal. I don't expect there to be guns out there. But I do, and I will make the argument, and here in Michigan, where our family has a cottage, I guess I'll just put it in these terms. The Arctic is a little bit like your family, where your parents leave you and your brother a cottage in the North Woods. Okay? You may live in South Africa and be doing something else, and your brother may live here in Grand Rapids and get up to the cabin every weekend. When you come back from South Africa and your brothers move the furniture around, you legally had the right to say where the furniture is going to go. You're both owners of the cottage. But the fact is, if he's been there and you're not, you really don't have much to say about it. And I think one of the reasons why we pushed for this Arctic policy on the part of the United States is that other nations are deciding, okay, what are the ground rules going to be in the Arctic? They're going and making their claims and setting their boundaries. They're going and making their rules for the use of Arctic resources within those boundaries. And the United States had been somewhat behind in that. So I'm very, very glad that we were able to push there to take a look at what we've got. Where is the United States extended continental shelf? What kind of offshore territory is at stake with the Law of the Sea Treaty, which is up before the Senate? We will gain, as a country, extended continental shelf. That's land outside our 200-mile limit, close to 2 Californias in area, after we make our claim, which is allowable after ratification. Quite a bit of that will be in the Arctic region. And with that will come, the State Department has estimated about $1 trillion in resources, perhaps 10 billion barrels in hydrocarbons, a large amount of mineral activity out in the Pacific Ocean, and thus we need to be prepared now to make a claim. It will take 10 years to make a claim, and it's not easy to do all the geology and the seismic work. We've had a significant $5 to $7 million program going on now each summer with our icebreakers for a period of years. We also have a situation pending with Canada, which is a little bit of fun, which actually we have 2 situations with Canada. The first one is, where does our oceanward boundary from the U.S.-Canadian border between Alaska and the Yukon extend to the north offshore? That boundary was set when 2 other countries owned that land. Canada was then fully part of Britain. Alaska was then fully part of Russia. And in 1825, when that boundary was set, we set it to all of the treaty documents just went right to the ocean edge. We didn't go any further. And it was a straight north-south meridian. Under customary law, you extend your extraterritorial boundary in the direction that the shoreline faces. You go perpendicular to the shoreline. So you can see the United States claim would head northeast. The Canadian claim says, no, let's just take that line straight north. That particular slice of pie, which is over it was about 6,250 square nautical miles, has a significant amount of oil and gas in it. And so this is one issue that it would behoove us as countries to try to solve before we go to the United Nations to say who owns what in the Arctic. On the western side of Alaska, we have a boundary with Russia that actually is fairly well established. It has not been ratified by the Russian Duma. There are a few people in the United States who say we should have gotten more, but the fact is both governments are generally in agreement about that boundary, and so we don't have a dispute there. A second issue, and something that was very clearly enunciated in the Arctic policy which came out, is the question of the Northwest Passage. Now, the question of who owns the Northwest Passage is really moot. That land in the Northwest Passage, undersea land in the Northwest Passage, is Canadian. It's fully within the 200-mile limit that's been there for some time. It would be within the extended continental shelf of any area that would go off there, but it doesn't. And the fact is there's no question that Canada has sovereignty there, except for the fact that we claim and we believe it is an international strait. That is a waterway. It is similar to Gibraltar, similar to other straits in the world where freedom of navigation is enjoyed by all nations of the world. And that's the dispute that we have with Canada. It's also a dispute that we have with Russia. On the northern edge of Russia is the Northern Sea Route. And the Russians want to charge you a tariff to be in the Northern Sea Route. And in that issue, We'll get to that in a little bit. But the United States is clearly, with most of the nations of the world, argued for freedom of navigation in that area. Now, I should say one other thing before I move off that subject. There is an article in the Law of the Sea called Article 234, which says that in an area with traditionally ice-covered waters, a nation can extend environmental management offshore. And in that case, we accept the right of Canada to come up with regulation to protect and have safe shipping and so forth. So ultimately, while this is an argument that often flares up in the newspapers between us, often causes lots of arguments, it's one where we really see a legal process in place to understand it, but ultimately we need to come to some agreement to quell down the fire and the noise. Question number 3 is maintaining biodiversity. Some questions. Should we allow fishing in the Arctic? And what if we don't and others do? Should we seek an Arctic high seas agreement? And what cooperation can help endangered species? There was a conference held in Greenland in May of last year where the 5 nations that actually have Arctic Ocean territory, so Iceland was not invited, Finland was not invited, let's see, what would be the third or the 8th? Sweden was not invited. But the 5 nations that do border the Arctic Ocean made a declaration that said, we don't need an Arctic treaty. We can settle all these issues through existing mechanisms in international law, especially if we ratify the Law of the Sea. Now, we did try to get language in this declaration that says, well, at least have freedom of access for science in the Arctic in the same way that we have it in Antarctica. I can take a group of scientists anywhere in Antarctica with the permission of my country's authorities and go anywhere. I can't do that in the Arctic Ocean. And one of the questions and one of the challenges of the Law of the Sea is that we're likely to get to a situation where Russia, Canada, some others might say, don't send in your ships. 11 of the last 13 times we've asked the Russians for permission to enter their territorial waters for routine scientific issues. We've been turned down. So we are trying to get a better treaty in this, but the declaration of the ministers here in Greenland was that we don't need a circumpolar treaty, that we have enough international law in place to set what's going on. This hasn't made some people happy. The World Wildlife Fund has published 2 documents, one calling for international governance and regulation of the marine Arctic, an analysis of gaps. I will say that I, as a writer, and I'm not always agreeing with the World Wildlife Fund, but in this case I've argued that there's at least a series of international agreements we need to come to in the Arctic. One of them is a regional fisheries agreement. The United States will be hosting a conference, not a negotiating session, but a conference in Alaska next fall to look at that issue. And there are some other issues which I'll talk about which at least could fill out some of these gaps in the Arctic. And that leads to our questions of safe development. Should the United States seek an Arctic shipping regime? What search and rescue is needed with an accessible Arctic? And what provisions should Arctic nations make for an environmental emergency? I mentioned before that it's not just the accessible Arctic, the ice going away, that is changing the mode of access in the Arctic. It's also changes in technology. If you look at this ship, it's a double-ended ship design where the bow is V-shaped and it's made for heavy seas. The stern is spoon-shaped and it's made to be able to back over ice and be an effective icebreaker. And as you can see, this ship, which was built by Finnish shipyards for Norilsk Nickel, large Russian mining company, is actually leading the Russian icebreaker through the ice pack there rather than being led by the icebreaker in the inset in the upper left-hand corner of the picture. Part of that is because the design, it's not only the hull design, but the propulsion is an azopod propulsion, which was first used in the United States on the Great Lakes icebreaker here. I guess it's the Sheboygan. That can turn 360 degrees and basically make your stern your bow, and vice versa. That has made shipping much, much more economically efficient and has brought the prospect of global shipping through the Arctic Ocean to the present day. We have called together all of the leading Arctic shippers, or all of the leading global shippers, and actually have said, what would you need to be effective in operating in the Arctic. And they came back and they said, we need a little bit more governance. We need some ground rules, and we need a continued set of demand for resources and trade. But if you have that, we'll have an Arctic saga. If we ignore rulemaking and we have demand, we'll have an Arctic race, and it's going to be unstable. We'll have bad actors. We'll have people who are not participating very well. If we don't have the demand, we may have polar lows, and everything will be the same. But you could have too much government and not have anything work at all. So this was the analysis that we'll be delivering to the ministers, suggesting what former Assistant Secretary of State Dan Sullivan said in a speech last year. 3 words: safe, secure, reliable Arctic shipping regime is vital to the development of Arctic resources, especially given the Arctic ice retreat we witnessed in the summer of 2007. And that regime can only come through cooperation, not competition among Arctic nations. Now listen to this sentence: denial of passage through international waterways, even though they may be territorial waters, and burdensome transit requirements will not benefit any nation in the long run. So here's a chief negotiator for the United States arguing for freedom of navigation in the Arctic, but have it with a cooperative regime that makes sense. And you think about a situation. This is a guy who's sent around the world when we're talking about routing pipelines through the Caucasus, or talking about cooperation to fight piracy in the South Seas, where it is very much the United States' goal as a nation to see safe, secure, reliable shipping, to see a place where no troll under the bridge can turn off the spigot, as some nations have done. And so what we're arguing for is some kind of shipping regime in the Arctic that doesn't welcome massive development as much as it says let's do it carefully and do it appropriately. I like to use as a model something which is very close here in the Great Lakes, which is the St. Lawrence Seaway model. Here you have 2 nations which govern a seaway in the Great Lakes, where a master sailing a ship from, say, Poland to Chicago would cross the U.S.-Canadian border 23 times. Yet there's one number to call, one place to get an inspection, one general set of rules, one place to pay your bill. And I think that we need to look with Canada and Russia, certainly at our end of the Arctic, with the other nations of the Arctic, to see what kind of safe, secure, reliable shipping where we make investments in a concerted fashion, where we make sure that we've got the capability to clean up oil spills, where we make sure we've got the capability to together as allies, because we are all allies or friends in this case, to fight piracy and other issues. We are already beginning these discussions across the Bering Strait with the Russians, ultimately to come up with some kind of regime that we can take to the International Maritime Organization. This is the Bering Strait. I said we jokingly call this the Bering Gate at some points, but there are several times when, say, whale migrations are happening on the eastern side where we might want to shift ships over to the western side to not disturb the whale migrations, for example. And so there are reasons that we, one, want to keep this strait open for business because it's a very important precedent to have around the world, but 2, to have rules to protect the environment, and that we can only do with international cooperation. We also have the environmental security issue. The picture on the upper left is the Selendang Ayu, a soybean ship carrying soybeans from the United States to East Asia, which crashed off the Aleutians. Actually, 2 members, we lost a Coast Guard helicopter trying to rescue the crew of that ship, and several members of the crew died of the ship. Our coasties were okay, but it was not what any of us wanted to see happen, and it was a major spill. We've seen other spills in the north, and then lower right-hand corner is the MS Explorer, which was stricken off Antarctica in November of 2007. What's interesting about this ship is here is a ship that you might sign up for, I dare say, on a World Affairs Council cruise to go to Antarctica, and there is effectively no search and rescue in these polar regions to take care of a major ship fire or a ship striking an iceberg. What happened here is that the Explorer had a competitor that was nearby that was able to rescue the crew nearby. So our first attempt at an Arctic search and rescue agreement might be to get operators to travel in concert, but also to try to bring more equipment north. This slide provided by the Coast Guard shows where we've got helicopter ranges right now, search and rescue coverage in Alaska, and you can see that there's none really in the north. That the range of a helicopter without refueling doesn't get you to where the ships are already operating with tourists in the upper part of the Bering Strait, and some of them coming into Barrow. We will be coming out with the submarine shipping assessment this spring, calling for fast and immediate cooperation on marine safety in this region. Let me finalize by saying, what does Arctic change mean for the United States to reach our goals in global affairs? And that means we have to have the appropriate assets. Question that we argued about in this National Security Council analysis is, should the United States build new icebreakers, and should we move the Coast Guard north? The Commission took a position very early on that the United States must maintain its global maritime capability as a government and as a nation, and that we need new polar-class icebreakers. We have two polar-class icebreakers that were commissioned in the Nixon administration, 1970. One of them barely leaves the dock. The other was about to do a training mission north of the Bering Strait last spring, and the National Science Foundation called it off. Why'd you call it off, I asked. Well, because we're afraid we're going to break the icebreaker in the ice north of the Bering Strait. Now, if our most powerful icebreaker can't go into the ice because we're afraid we're going to break it, that's prima facie evidence we need a new icebreaker. And I'm sorry, Congress is probably not going to include that in this package, but we're going to continue to work for it. Thad Allen, in a New York Times article in 2007, said, "I'm not qualified to talk about the scientific issues related to global warming." He's the Commandant of the Coast Guard. "All we know is we have a new operating environment up there, and we're responsible for, and it's changing." This is a ship which showed up off Barrow, Alaska. 400 people were wandering around the village. Nobody in the village knew they were coming. People are coming to this part of the world. We're seeing a number of other tourist ships operating in our part of the world, and of course I showed you over 250 coastal voyages last year around the coast of Greenland. So the Coast Guard is moving north. The Coast Guard Admiral in the 17th District told me the other day, he said, what we learned so far is we need bigger helicopters and smaller boats to be able to operate in this area because we can no longer do what they're doing on the, well, actually the lower right-hand side, that C-130 is on land, but we can no longer count on landing airplanes on the ice to do search and rescue. So our search and rescue assets that are available for search and rescue or for an environmental response are fairly limited right now, and it is time to boost that capability. So this new Arctic policy I mentioned that was issued a month ago today has 6 different points that go much greater depth on the issues that I've talked about. I'm happy to answer questions about them. They do recognize our national security and homeland security needs in the North, look at ways and mechanisms to protect the environment, look at resource development and management to have rules that are environmentally sustainable. We want to strengthen institutions for international cooperation. We say we don't want to do a full-fledged Arctic treaty. We do want to ratify Law of the Sea, and we do want to move on with several sub-treaties such as a regional fisheries agreement and so forth. The argument made by the National Wildlife or the World Wildlife Foundation and others of do we have a high seas treaty, I will predict to you, may be the subject of another World Affairs Council Great Decisions series in years to come. We want to continue to involve indigenous communities in Arctic governance, and we want to enhance scientific monitoring and research in local, regional, and global environmental issues. And I will leave you with this. I have to go before the Congress and go before agencies of the government to justify spending your money, taxpayers' money, to do research in the Arctic. And I would submit to you that the Arctic, people will say, well, why does the Arctic matter? Why does it matter to somebody who lives in Michigan? And I'll put it this way, I can think of at least $5 trillion issues that we should all be concerned about. We talked about $1 trillion worth of Arctic ownership and sovereignty. We talk about fish, which is a multi-billion-dollar fishery, oil and gas, minerals in Arctic resources. We talk about global trade. Most people don't know this, but most air cargo now traveling between the continents, between the continents in the northern hemisphere, all passes through the Arctic. Over 20,000 people a week traverse the Arctic in commercial aircraft traveling between here and Asia and Europe. Climate change. We talked about what happens in the Arctic, if we're not paying attention to how the tundra exhales. We can manage everything we can out of our tailpipes here and lose it all there if we're not paying attention to what happens there. And finally, there's protecting shared values, culture and conservation, that is very, very important for research. So I'll leave it at that. I made it just slightly past 7 o'clock. I thank you very much for your attention and look forward to your questions.
Great, thank you.
Those of you who have questions, we have 2 microphones. We'll take them alternating fashion. It's wonderful to have somebody so well informed here. I'd like to start with just a quick question that has to do with what seem to be 2 things kind of at odds with one another, and that is, on one hand, the push to explore for oil and gas, the tremendous resources up there. On the other hand, the concern at the same time about the impact of the hydrocarbons that those things produce. How do you resolve an issue like that?
My left brain and my right brain.
Yeah.
It's very interesting. I'm here in Michigan where you make cars for a living. And if I go to buy a car today and it's not a Chevy Volt, which I can't buy, I expect to buy a car that will last for the next decade or so. That car runs on gasoline. Alaskans generally believe that if we are going to consume gasoline, let's produce it here at home. And let's do it safely and environmentally here and so forth. That doesn't mean that, I like to tell the story when I was in the 8th grade, I wrote papers about I remember writing a paper about an electric car. My son, who's in the 12th grade, built an electric car in his high school last year. And the fact is that we are going to go to alternative fuels, but we will likely need hydrocarbons in some way, shape, or form for some time to come. And so the residents of the Arctic who work to produce these hydrocarbons work to do it safely. This is a question that also comes up very heavily in Norway. I will tell you that Governor Palin, who recently announced a plan to get 50% of Alaska's power generation on renewables in the next 20 years, or by 2020, actually, if I have the date right. And we have said, we're going to do that for the environment. We're going to do that for cost stabilization. We're going to move ahead and do it. So we don't see that much of a conflict. And I guess I would say this, is that if you have a religious belief that we just have to get off fossil fuels, cutting off production where you can do it the safest place, the safest way, and with existing infrastructure may not be the smartest way to get to where you want to go. And that's why over 70% of Alaskans support continued oil development in the north. Other questions? Sir.
In all your discussion, and it was a wonderful discussion, the people of Alaska has not been mentioned. Population. I was a little bit appalled by the fact that legislation was passed so to either limit or eliminate fishing, at least for certain periods of time. The value of the fishing industry, as you mentioned in your talk, is in the millions or maybe billions of dollars for the people who live up there. What consideration is given, and are they being brought into the conversation to the point where they can give an attitude from somebody that's going to be directly affected?
I was going to try to go back to the map here to answer your question. Let me say this. One of the very interesting things that has happened because of the change in sea ice is 2 federal agencies that have had virtually no major presence in the Arctic have said, gosh, we got to get up there. One of them was the Coast Guard, and as I showed you, they were doing experiments on, what kind of ships to have and so forth. And the Admiral of the Coast Guard blames me. He said, if it wasn't for that briefing that we had done at the Alaska Command, I probably wouldn't have had my tour here extended to do this. Likewise, the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, which has always managed fish just south of the Bering Strait, with one small fishery to the north, came and went into these communities where they've never really been. The people who regulate whaling and so forth have been there. And they went there substantially and they said, okay, what's going to happen? And the U.S. Senate passed a resolution that said, let's close off fishing there. And the council said, we're going to take about 1.5 years to get to that decision. Now, the thorough public hearings that were held people said, well, you're not going to close off my subsistence fishing, and the answer was right. And then the fishing community was asked, and they said, well, we have already lost quota in the Bering Sea to fish that may be moving west to Russia or north of the Bering Strait. But I think people generally agreed that it would be not smart to go in there and set fishing quotas unless you've got good environmental base background. Now, I mentioned before that one of our challenges is getting access to Russian waters to do research. A fundamental problem that we have right now is that when Russia invades Georgia and the United States will show them, we cut off 3 cruises last year that were joint environmental research to figure out what's happening to those fish so that we could set those quotas. They weren't all cut in response to Georgia, but there were 3 that fell through the cracks. And one thing that we're urging the new Obama administration to do in its talks with Russia is to have a much more regular cooperation in science research across the Bering Strait to do this and to keep the people involved. So I guess I would say this, a short answer to your question is people now support this. We've already taken, our quotas have taken major cuts because of moving fish stocks. But to just stop and say don't go further doesn't make any sense. Stop and do the research so that you can ensure that you have sustainable fisheries for the long run. And one of the things the Coast Guard will tell you is that if you had a fishing quota up there, even if you don't, which we don't now, you need to have enforcement capability. If we don't have the ships, we can't enforce it. So we've been arguing for the resources to do the research and the resources to do the law enforcement, and perhaps we will see a fishery in the Arctic Ocean. Sir?
It has been forecasted that when the polar ice melted, it would increase 3 feet the ocean in the east coast. With all this melting, where did the water go?
Well, first off, if you look at ice cubes in a glass of water, when the ice cubes melt, the water level does not rise. Okay, so floating sea ice, when it melts, does not change the sea level. A warming ocean, though, does change the sea level because as the ocean warms, the molecules expand, and so you have some expansion there. The places that we're watching most closely are the major ice cap of Greenland and the major ice cap of Antarctica. And the glaciers of Alaska, Europe, and the Himalayas are also very much part of the equation, but not as significant. There is one very fast-moving glacier right now in in Greenland that has the potential to drain much more of that ice cap. And some of the numbers that you see about rising sea level are dependent on what happens there. And I have to tell you, I've seen conflicting science. There was a paper at the American Geophysical Union in San Francisco in December that said it's a coming. And there was a paper given to us last year at Boulder saying all the physics, you'd have to really turn up the heat to have it come. So I guess I would say that sea level rise for most of the United States is probably a century level threat as the science consensus is now, but it's not one to ignore. But it will come from changing glacier patterns. And the other thing that has to be remembered about glaciers is that glaciers, if you have cold weather, a glacier's size is a very simple input versus output model. If there's more snow that doesn't melt every year and turns into ice, then there's water and everything else that comes out the other end, then the glacier's growing. And sometimes climate change can actually have your glaciers grow in a warmer situation than you've had before. So we have some glaciers, while most glaciers are receding, we have had some glaciers that have been growing with change patterns. So the fact is that I would put other issues from removal of the polar ice cap, acceleration of heating the earth, acceleration of acidification of the oceans, potential change in the ocean currents, probably further ahead of threats than sea level rise, but I don't believe we should ignore sea level rise. Sure.
Are there any unique differences between the Arctic and the Antarctic that we can contrast? For example, is there more resource in the Arctic? Are there more people? Why is it more problematic up north than it seems down south?
Sure. Very simply put, Antarctica is a continent which is the common heritage of mankind. It is owned by all of us. The Arctic Ocean is the common heritage of mankind as well, except that these areas around the Arctic Ocean, at least the 200-mile limit and soon the extended continental shelf, will be under the sovereign control of countries. And so the 5 nations who will have that sovereign control of significant parts of the ocean have the legal rights to govern that, and that's not really questioned by the global community. So at the very least, you have countries that own something versus countries that don't own something for most of the Arctic versus the Antarctic. When it comes to natural resource development, those countries are determined to develop those resources safely. Whereas there may be significant natural gas deposits off Antarctica, there's significant fisheries resources offshore, but we've decided in the name of science and so forth not to have that development happen there. Whereas in some cases, especially if you move into the Bering Sea, the Russians and Norwegians have been fishing those areas for hundreds of years. So there's not really a move to totally have a moratorium on this. There have been some calls for a moratorium on shipping and oil and gas development and some fishing, especially by the World Wildlife Fund, but it's going to be a difficult situation to get to there legally. Thanks, Paul.
Mr. Treadwell, is this working?
Yep.
My question is in regards to ownership of the territory as well. At the end, you mentioned that there are 5 main issues, there are $1 trillion issues. Of the 5, which you said were ownership, fishing, trade, climate, and then shared value, I believe is the 5th one. Which one is going to be the biggest obstacle when determining the law of the sea, if that happens? Was that asked? I didn't really know.
Could you repeat the question for both of them?
Is it on now?
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Sorry about that. This happened to me last time too, if you guys remember. My question was in regards to ownership of the territory, and it had to do with the $5 trillion issues. You mentioned that 5 were ownership, fishing, trade, climate, and then shared values was the last one.
Sure.
And my question was, which one is the biggest obstacle that we're going to see when it comes to determining the law of the sea treaty, which you had mentioned, and if that happens in the way that we expect?
The law of the sea treaty, just to give its legal status, has been ratified by enough nations now to be in force. What happened is that the nations of the world came together actually in the 70s and early 80s, wrote this treaty. The U.S. was a major negotiator in that treaty, and then it went to each government's democratic processes to be ratified. It has been ratified by, I believe now, all of the other Arctic nations except the United States. The issue of why hasn't the United States ratified this is a difficult issue. On the one hand, early on in the Reagan administration, President Reagan said, let's not ratify this because it takes away rights of American mining interests, for example, and so forth. So we sent our negotiators back to the table, and we had that ratified. Early on, the arguments against ratification were that it might take flexibility away from our military. And we have letters now from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I have an email on my computer from an analyst at the Pentagon who's saying, our real problem is that if we don't have that rule of the law, we've got problems with the military. You'll have people encroaching on international rights if we don't clearly see those rights established. So now the argument, and there are several people leading the debate against this, and I have to say I am a Republican, and I consider myself a conservative Republican, and often look very carefully before we bind ourselves internationally to, say, global law when our own sovereignty, in these cases you set your sovereignty aside. And the argument made is that the law of the sea treaty may well subject the United States to environmental regulation from offshore that we're not specifically choosing and debating right now. So I've asked some of the opponents, there are probably now enough votes to pass this in the Senate. How do you plan to deal with that issue? And they said we may deal with it with amendments and separate legislation. And I think that's appropriate. In foreign affairs, a long time our support for Taiwan had prevented us from recognizing China. And we passed an act which said no matter what happens with China, we are an ally with Taiwan on the issue of Taiwan being able to maintain its political independence. And likewise, I think we should, in passing the law of the sea, have very, very clear rules in the United States that says we pass this to get the international recognition, to have the international law, to have the umbrella agreements, to have these things like search and rescue and fisheries agreements and the extended land offshore. But we should protect our sovereign rights on environmental issues. So I think that's the solution there for getting that passed. As far as these other issues, I would say that ownership and sovereignty is a driver for us to pass the law. Fisheries management, oil and gas, minerals is certainly a driver for us to pass the law. Trade and shipping, if we went to the table and said let's have a global shipping agreement without being a ratifier of the law of the sea, I think we'd be, perhaps not well accepted at the table. Climate change is really not part of that at the present time. The shared values are, because actually this law allows us to go out to protect our shared values in areas with ways that we may not be able to without the law. So I guess I would say that most of these are drivers for the law of the sea, but that issue of sovereignty, which I struggle with myself, whether we look at the International Court of Criminal Court or any of these other issues, I think, in the end, I would argue that passage of the law of the sea with very strict rules on how our State Department lawyers interpret it is the solution for the United States.
With those problems that you stated that you could potentially foresee, do you think that there's anything, or do you see it as a possibility of us signing the law of the sea as it is right now? Or does there have to be some changes?
Well, it's very interesting. In this policy, which was signed by President Bush, he called for ratification of the law of the sea. And in fact, the Bush administration in 2004, actually made the provision for call of the law of the sea. The Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which was headed by either by Dick Lugar or by Joe Biden, had hearings and has produced a hearing record. Secretary Clinton was before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee for her ratification, and the law of the sea issue came up in relation to the Arctic, and she said that the United States will push to ratify, and John Kerry, who's the new head of the Foreign Relations Committee, said he plans to put it before the Senate this spring. So assuming that that's what the Senate does, I believe there are probably enough votes to pass it. Any other questions? Nobody's asked me if it's cold up there. We've had great skiing, by the way. We've had close to 200 inches of snow at the top of Alyeska this year, and we had great skiing on Saturday. Come on up. There's non-stops most of the time from Detroit in the summer, and we'd love to have you. I will just say one other thing. Paul had mentioned that he has some law students who study international law. That issue of how exactly do we protect ourselves from extranational governance on areas that aren't contemplated under the treaty would be a great thing for a law student to write about right now.
I might follow that up personally.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Great job.